the anxiety and the depression that you had to deal with when you were a player. Can you share that? I mean, I remember getting phone calls from you at 3 o'clock in the morning and just needing help.
Things were going so well. It was 2005 and we'd just won a premiership. I was engaged to Lucy. Everything was great. We had our own nice house at Henley and things were young. I was 22 and things were going so well. And then just started to think something was wrong in my head. So I went and got all these brain scans because I thought I had brain cancer. And I've got a bit of health anxiety and just kept going to Dr. Barnes. And he was just such a support. He's like, I don't reckon it's brain cancer, like you're pretty fit, you're playing footy, but if you want, I'll send you in for a brain scan and we'll do a head x-ray and an MRI. And so we got all these tests done and everything was fine. And after all that, just looked at me and said, you're physically fine. I think what you're dealing with is mental. And it sort of hit me. I thought I was going insane. So it sort of was hard. So yeah, it was probably 12 months of just trying to work out what was going on inside my head and the lack of sleep, which you really helped. Well, I remember staying in your house a couple of nights just because I couldn't sleep and I needed a new environment. What's the advice would be? Someone will help. Like I think someone is there to care for you, be that a doctor or a family member or a friend or someone at work, but they can't help unless they know about it.